In this video, we're going to be breaking down family massacres that are still unsolved. Let's get started with the DARDEEN family murders. The DARDEEN family murders. On the 18th of November 1987, in the tiny town of Ena, Illinois, police discovered one of the most brutal crime scenes in American history. Inside a small trailer home, they found a pregnant woman and her young son beaten to death. The violence was so severe that the mother had been forced into early labor, and the killer had also murdered the newborn baby. The husband was initially suspected, but his body was found the next day in a nearby field, shot and mutilated. Despite a massive investigation and a serial killer's confession, this horrific crime remains officially unsolved. Contextual overview. Ena, Illinois, was a sleepy little town in Jefferson County with a population of just 460 people in 1987. The town had the basics: a store, a gas station, a firehouse, a bank, and a post office, but not much else. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where people left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors. The surrounding area was rural farmland, with woods and fields stretching in every direction. Russell Keith Dardeen, who went by his middle name Keith, was 29 years old and worked as a water treatment plant operator at the Rend Lake Water Conservancy District nearby. He was originally from Mount Carmel, a town about 20 miles away, and had bought a mobile home in 1986 after completing his training for the job. The trailer was a light-colored, modest home that sat on rented land just outside Ena, positioned between Illinois Route 37 and the former Illinois Central Railroad tracks. Keith's wife, Ruby Elaine Dardeen, who also went by her middle name Elaine, was 30 years old. She was from Albion, a small town closer to Ena. Elaine worked at an office supply store in Mount Vernon, the Jefferson County seat. Together, they had a 3-year-old son named Peter, who had been born on the 5th of July, 1984. The family was close-knit and well-liked in their community. Both Keith and Elaine were active members of a small Baptist church in the area. Keith sang lead vocals in the church's musical ensemble, while Elaine played the piano. People who knew them described them as kind, hard-working, and devoted to their faith. Keith's mother, Joanne Dardeen, would later say that her son was so careful with money that he would buy 50-cent cans of soda and resell them at work for a small profit, saving every penny for his son Peter's future college education. In 1987, Elaine became pregnant with their second child. They were excited about the new baby, who was due on the 11th of January 1988. They had already picked out names: Casey if it was a girl, Ian if it was a boy. The pending addition to their family had led Keith and Elaine to make plans to move. They put their mobile home up for sale and began looking for a house with an extra bedroom in Mount Carmel, Keith's hometown. But there was another reason they wanted to move. Jefferson County had seen a disturbing wave of violence in the 2 years leading up to 1987. There had been 15 homicides in the county during that time. This was an alarming number for a county with only 38,000 people. One particularly horrific case involved a teenager named Thomas Odell from Mount Vernon, who had killed his own parents and 3 siblings in 1985. The murders happened one by one as each family member came home that night. The violence in the area had made Keith extremely protective of his family. According to Keith's friend, he had become so cautious that one night, when a young woman came to their mobile home asking if she could use the phone, Keith refused to let her in. In May 1987, a 10-year-old girl had been raped and murdered in the area, and this crime had deeply affected Keith's sense of security. Despite his careful nature and protective instincts, Keith and his family would soon become victims themselves. Build-up. The 18th of November 1987 started as a normal Wednesday for Keith Dardeen. He was scheduled to work his regular shift at the water treatment plant, which began at 7 in the morning. Keith was known as an extremely reliable worker. He showed up on time, did his job well, and always called if there was any reason he couldn't make it to work. But on this particular Wednesday, Keith didn't show up for his shift. More unusual, he didn't call to explain his absence. His supervisor tried calling the Dardeen home throughout the day, but no one answered the phone. By afternoon, the supervisor was concerned enough to call Keith's parents. Keith's mother and father were divorced but still lived near each other in Mount Carmel. Neither of them had heard from Keith. This was unusual and worrying. Keith kept in regular contact with his family, especially his mother Joanne. The fact that no one could reach him or his family raised immediate red flags. By early evening, Keith's father, Don DARDEEN, contacted the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. He explained the situation and agreed to drive down to Ina with his set of keys to the trailer. Deputies arranged to meet him there to check on the family. The DARDEEN trailer sat in a somewhat isolated location. It was positioned on private land near Route 37, a busy state highway. If you looked west from the trailer, you could see Interstate 57 about 2,000 feet away. The property was bordered by woods and was relatively private, though traffic passed by regularly on the nearby roads. Around 6:30 in the evening, Don DARDEEN arrived at his son's mobile home with the sheriff's deputies. Keith's truck was parked outside, which suggested he was home, but his red 1981 Plymouth car was missing. The deputies and Don approached the trailer and knocked on the door. There was no answer. They called out. Still nothing. Using the keys Don had brought, they unlocked the back door and entered the mobile home. What they found inside would become one of the most horrific crime scenes any of them had ever witnessed. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Main event. The scene inside the trailer was beyond comprehension. In the bedroom, tucked into the waterbed, were 3 bodies. Elaine DARDEEN lay there, along with her 3-year-old son Peter and a newborn baby girl. All 3 had been beaten to death. Elaine had been bound with duct tape and gagged. The killer had used Peter's own baseball bat as the murder weapon, a birthday present Keith had given his son earlier that year. The beating Elaine suffered was so severe and brutal that it had forced her into premature labor. She was 7 months pregnant at the time. The killer had shown absolutely no mercy. After Elaine gave birth to her daughter, the killer had beaten the newborn baby to death as well. The infant, who they would have named Casey, had lived only moments before being killed. The violence was extreme beyond reason. The bodies had been carefully arranged in the bed together and covered with bedding. The area around them had been cleaned up, suggesting the killer felt no rush to leave. There were no signs of forced entry. The back door was unlocked. Valuable items were left untouched. A VCR and portable camera sat in the living room, undisturbed. Cash and jewelry were found in another room, also untouched. But Keith was not there. His red Plymouth was missing. This immediately made investigators suspect that Keith had murdered his own family and fled. It was a logical assumption given the circumstances. They put out alerts to find Keith and his vehicle. The next day, November 19, Keith's body was found in a field near their home, not far from the trailer. He had been shot 3 times, and his genitals had been severed from his body. His red Plymouth was found parked outside the police station in Benton, a town about 11 miles from the DARDEEN home. Blood inside the car indicated that Keith had been murdered inside the vehicle. The forensic examination revealed something crucial about the timing. Keith had been dead for 24 to 36 hours when his body was found. The bodies in the trailer had been dead for about 12 hours when they were discovered. This meant Keith had been killed within an hour of his family, but the timeline was tight and confusing. The crime scene painted a picture of calculated brutality. The killer, or killers, had taken their time. After murdering Elaine, Peter, and the newborn baby, they had tucked the bodies into bed together and cleaned up the scene. This suggested they did not feel any urgency to leave, despite being in a trailer that could be seen from a busy highway. Investigators were left with many questions. How had the killer gained entry with no signs of forced entry? Had the family known their attacker? Why was Keith killed separately from his family? Was he taken from the trailer and murdered elsewhere? Or had he arrived home to find his family already dead and been ambushed by the killer? The brutality of the murders suggested extreme rage or sadism. Elaine and Peter had suffered tremendously. The murder of a newborn infant went beyond comprehension. The mutilation of Keith's body suggested a personal element, perhaps revenge or a message being sent. There was a small amount of marijuana found in the trailer, but nothing to suggest the family was involved in drug dealing. Keith's mother would later say she believed the marijuana belonged to the killer, not her son. Investigators found a stack of papers with sports scores, which led them to briefly consider whether Keith had gambling debts, but they found no evidence to support this theory. They found no evidence of extramarital affairs by either Keith or Elaine that could have triggered a crime of passion. They found no evidence of grudges against the family or financial troubles that might provide a motive. The couple appeared to have been exactly what they seemed, a young, hard-working family preparing to welcome their second child and move to a bigger home. Immediate aftermath. The discovery of the DARDEEN family's bodies sent shockwaves through the small community and beyond. Residents who had already been frightened by the string of murders in Jefferson County now lived in absolute terror. Gun sales increased dramatically. People who had never locked their doors before now installed security systems and double-checked their locks every night. Local law enforcement poured resources into the investigation. 30 detectives worked full-time on the case. Over 100 people were interviewed. Every possible angle was explored. But despite the enormous effort, no significant leads emerged. The crime was so brutal and senseless that it attracted national attention. News outlets across the country covered the story. The savage nature of the murders, particularly the killing of the newborn baby, shocked even hardened investigators and journalists who had seen countless terrible crimes. Keith's mother, Joanne Dardeen, was devastated. She had lost her son, her daughter-in-law, her grandson, and a granddaughter she never got to meet. But Joanne refused to let grief paralyze her. She became a tireless advocate for solving the case. At least once a week, she called the sheriff's office to make sure they were still working on finding her family's killer. She spoke to media outlets, hoping to keep the case in the public eye. Keith's sister, Anita Dardeen Knapp, was also profoundly affected. She would later say that she was still numb decades after the murders, that she knew she would never be the same person she might have been if her brother and his family had lived. Keith's lifelong friends were heartbroken. Kevin Harris, who had been the best man at Keith and Elaine's wedding, could barely speak about them without choking up years later. He and Keith's other friend, Bill Reed, remembered Keith and Elaine as two of the nicest people you'd ever want to meet. The lack of a clear motive tortured everyone connected to the case. Why would someone commit such horrific violence against a seemingly innocent family? What could possibly drive someone to beat a pregnant woman, her toddler, and a newborn baby to death? Why mutilate Keith's body in such a specific way? Theories emerged, but none fit all the evidence. Joanne wondered if someone had tried to force Keith to sell drugs, and he refused. She also considered that perhaps someone had been interested in Elaine romantically, and she had rejected them. But there was no evidence for either scenario. The timing of Keith's death raised questions about whether he had been present during the attack on his family or killed separately before even knowing what happened to them. If he was killed first, how did the killer gain access to the trailer without forced entry? If Keith was killed after his family, why did the killer take him away and murder him elsewhere? If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Long-term repercussions. For years, the Dardeen case remained cold. Investigators continued to review the evidence, but no suspects emerged. The case files grew thick with interviews, forensic reports, and theories, but none led to an arrest. The murders joined the ranks of unsolved crimes that haunt law enforcement and families alike. Then in 1999, something happened that seemed to offer hope. A drifter and convicted serial killer named Ángel Maturino Reséndez, also known as Rafael Reséndez Ramirez, surrendered to authorities in Texas. Reséndez often traveled around the country by hopping freight trains, choosing his victims near railroad tracks. He frequently beat his victims to death. Given that the Dardeen trailer was near railroad tracks and the victims had been beaten, investigators in Illinois looked into whether Reséndez could be connected to the case. However, they were never able to link him to the Dardeen murders. Shortly after, another name emerged that would dominate the case for years: Tommy Lynn Sells. On the last day of December 1999, cells broke into a home near Del Rio, Texas, and cut the throats of two sleeping girls, 13-year-old Kayleen Harris and 10-year-old Crystal Surlis. Kayleen died, but Crystal survived. She was able to help police create a composite sketch of her attacker, which led directly to Cell's arrest. While awaiting trial, Sells began confessing to numerous murders he claimed to have committed while drifting around the country. He said he had killed over 70 people across multiple states. Police confirmed he was responsible for at least 22 murders. Sells often traveled by hopping freight trains and working at carnivals, which gave him access to victims across the country. One of the murders Sells confessed to was the DARDEEN family killings. According to his confession, he had been traveling through southern Illinois in November 1987. He claimed he met Keith Dardeen at a truck stop near Mount Vernon. In another version of his story, he said he met Keith at a local pool hall. In both versions, Sells claimed that Keith invited him home for dinner. Then, according to Sells, Keith propositioned him to have a threesome with him and Elaine. In yet another version of the story, Sells said he simply saw a "for sale" sign on the trailer and saw an opportunity. The problem with Sells's confession was that his story kept changing. He couldn't keep his details straight. When asked about information that had been kept from media reports, he seemed less reliable. He claimed Keith was shot in a specific seat of the Plymouth, but the evidence contradicted this. When asked how Elaine's body was positioned, he first answered incorrectly, then correctly, which could have been a lucky guess. Investigators had serious doubts about Sells' confession. Keith's family and friends certainly didn't believe it. They pointed out that Keith had become so protective of his family after the local murders that he wouldn't even let a stranger use their phone. The idea that he would invite a rough-looking drifter home for dinner was absurd to anyone who knew him. The claim about a sexual proposition was even more ridiculous to those who knew Keith. Joanne Dardeen initially believed Sells might be guilty when she first heard his confession, but as more details emerged and inconsistencies piled up, she changed her mind. She came to believe that Sells was lying about killing her family. Before Sells was executed in 2014, Joanne said, "I wanted him to stay alive until I know positively he didn't do it. The things he said do not match up with what I know about Keith." Despite the doubts, some law enforcement officials believed Sells was guilty. Jefferson County State's Attorney Douglas Hoffman said, "Sells remained the #1 suspect even after his execution." Sheriff Roger Mulch agreed. A county deputy who interviewed Sells in his Texas cell claimed Sells knew details of the crime that had been kept confidential. However, even these officials admitted that Sells likely added false details to his story, as he was known to do. Sells was never charged with the Dardeen murders. Texas prison authorities would not allow him to leave the state to assist Illinois police with their investigation. Without being able to bring Sells to Illinois, and without physical evidence linking him to the crime, prosecutors felt they couldn't build a strong enough case. Gary Duncan, the state's attorney for Jefferson County at the time, declined to file murder charges due to lack of sufficient evidence. Sells had a long history of false confessions. Police in Texas came to believe that, like another Texas serial killer named Henry Lee Lucas, Sells was confessing to crimes he didn't commit in an attempt to avoid or delay his death sentence. Sells was executed in April 2014, and with his death went any chance of getting the truth from him if he had indeed been involved. The case remains officially unsolved. In recent years, Detective Captain Scott Burge of the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office has been in charge of the case. He recently worked to digitize the massive case file, which fills multiple binders. Each binder has Sells's name listed as a suspect on the spine, but Burge acknowledges there are many other persons of interest when you go through the files. Joanne Dardeen, now in her 80s, continues to speak about the case to anyone who will listen. When asked if she has ever thought about giving up, she responds firmly, "No, I'll never give up. Never." She credits her faith in God for helping her get through the decades of grief and frustration. Keith's sister Anita has questions that still need answers. She wonders why DNA testing hasn't been done on certain items from the scene. If the killer spent time in the trailer, surely they touched something or left some trace. She believes evidence might still exist that could solve the case. Keith's friends still want to understand not just who did it, but why. Bill Reed explained, "For me, it's not a question of who did it. It's the why they did it. I need that why. Without a motive, without understanding what drove someone to commit such evil, the case feels incomplete, even beyond the lack of an arrest." The DARDEEN murders remain one of the worst unsolved mass murders in American history. The brutality of the crimes, the innocence of the victims, and the complete absence of a clear motive make it a case that continues to haunt everyone connected to it. Mike Anthus, who served as detective captain in charge of the case until he left the department in 1994, described the investigation this way: "I always used to refer to these types of cases as you're standing in the center of a clock, and every minute on the face of that clock is another angle, theory, motive, and you go out that direction, and you follow it until you run it to ground, and it's either it is or it isn't, and you come back to center again, and look for the next leads, and keep turning the rocks. The case remains open." Burge stressed this point when he said, "Until we get somebody, or some people, in custody on this, and we get them prosecuted, or whatever else, it's going to remain open. And I want the family to know that, too." Authorities continue to ask anyone with information about the 1,987 murders of Keith, Elaine, Peter, and baby Casey Dardeen to contact the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Joanne Dardeen has said people can contact her too, and she'll make sure the information gets to the right people. The Dardeen family murders stand as a reminder that some crimes are so terrible, so senseless, that they defy explanation. A young couple preparing to welcome their second child, living quietly in a small trailer in rural Illinois, were destroyed by violence so extreme that it still shocks people decades later. The fact that no one has been held accountable for these murders only adds to the tragedy. Somewhere, someone knows what happened that November night in 1987. Until that person comes forward or is discovered, the Dardeen family will never have justice, and Joanne will continue her lonely vigil, calling investigators, speaking to journalists, and refusing to let the world forget what happened to her son and his beautiful family. Summary: on the 18th of November 1987, police discovered a horrific scene in a trailer outside Ena, Illinois. Elaine Dardeen, who was 7 months pregnant, and her 3-year-old son Peter, had been beaten to death with a baseball bat. The attack was so brutal that Elaine went into early labor, and the killer murdered the newborn baby as well. Her husband Keith was initially suspected, but his body was found the next day, shot multiple times, and sexually mutilated. The small rural community was already on edge from 15 murders in the previous 2 years. Despite 30 detectives working the case and over 100 interviews, no clear suspect emerged. Years later, serial killer Tommy Lynn Sells confessed to the murders, but his story kept changing and conflicted with evidence. Keith's family rejected the confession, noting that Keith was too protective to invite strangers home. Sells was never charged and died in 2014. The case remains officially unsolved. Keith's mother, Joanne, now in her 80s, continues fighting for answers, calling investigators weekly and vowing to never give up. The brutal, senseless nature of the crimes and complete absence of motive make this one of America's most disturbing unsolved family massacres. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.